Today's lecture is going to be an introduction to Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this is a novel written by the author Stevenson. And today in this lecture, we are going to talk about some of the contextual elements and historical elements that lead to this novel. So it's going to be an introductory lecture. First, going to talk about a brief biography of the author Robert Louis Stevenson. Next, we are going to talk about a little bit about the historical context. Next, we'll talk about some related literary works, and then we'll move on and I'll mention some key facts about this text. This lecture is going to be small. It's going to be short. We are not going to dwell in too much, but these are the few introductory elements, as I mentioned, that we are going to talk about today. So let me begin straight away with a brief biography of the author. So Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Scotland, right, which is in present-day United Kingdom. So he was born in Scotland to a family of lighthouse designers, right? Lighthouse is you must be aware of what a lighthouse is. It's there where the land meets the sea, and it is there to guide ships to safely reach the shore. And so Stevenson grew up in a very religious household, and the ideas of the Bible greatly affected the imagination of the literature he would write later, right? So his early experiences at home, which was very religious, that greatly influenced his writing. So he has written many popular books. I'll talk about them a little bit later, but it is also worth noting that Robert Louis Stevenson was a kind of very sickly child, right? And he suffered from respiratory problems for most of his life, right? And why am I saying this? So on the one hand, I'm giving you biographical information about the author. On the second hand, it is important to note that all of these early experiences of living in a household where people were very religious, or the fact that he was himself very sickly, these greatly affected his own writing, right? So Stevenson did travel, and he studied widely in his youth and wrote his first two books before he finally married a woman named Fanny Osborne, right? And this is around 1879, 1880, around that time. And over the next decade, he wrote many successful works of literature, even though his health kept on deteriorating, right? And one of his most successful novels was published around that time, and it is titled Treasure Island, right? And Treasure Island is an immensely popular novel. Some of you may even have heard about it, or perhaps a few of you may have read it as well. So Treasure Island is also written by the same person who has written Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Okay, and so what is the unique quality that Robert Louis Stevenson has? His unique quality is that he is a prolific storyteller, right? Not only does he keep on writing one story after the other, but his stories are extremely engaging or arresting, right? So very often you start reading a Robert Louis Stevenson story, whether it's a short novel or a longish novel or a short story. So no matter what work of literature you read that is written by Stevenson, you'll find that the plot is very, very interesting, filled with suspense, filled with action, so filled with intrigue, right? You will always feel like knowing, or you will always have the question, what happens next, right? So that is one of the qualities that is there to his writing, and it's very much present in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So despite being a prolific writer, as I mentioned before, his health continued to plague him, and he finally died of tuberculosis, and this is sometime in 1894. So as you can see, much of his life was spent in dealing with the sickness that he had suffered from since childhood. But this did not stop him from writing, and this did not stop him from being one of the most successful authors of all time. Okay, so moving on, the second point I'm going to talk about in this introductory lecture is the historical context of this book, that is the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, I already gave you some approximate dates, right? Dates when he published Treasure Island, approximate date of his passing away. Now, if you have noted, or if you are aware of his lifetime, you will know that Robert Louis Stevenson lived his entire life during the Victorian era. And what is the Victorian era? Victorian era means the lifetime of Queen Victoria, right? And Victoria was the Queen of Britain, and it was during her lifetime that Robert Louis Stevenson lived. And for reference, to give you some reference, Queen Victoria was the queen from sometime around 1837. I may not be exact about the dates, but sometime around 1837 to 1901. So close to 65 or 70 years she was the queen, and India was a part of the British Empire during her entire lifetime, right? So during her rule. So that is for reference, so that you can locate where in history you can place him, right? So now let's come back to the historical context I said I would mention. So the Victorian era, like I said, saw science and technology soared to heights, right? Before that, it's not like science and technology, it's not like they didn't exist before, they always existed, right? But during the Victorian era, science and technology became very prominent, right? Major inventions were made during this time. A lot of the technology that we are aware of today, continue to use today, was formulated during the Victorian era. For example, telephone, telegraph, major means of communication, major means of transportation, these were all invented and popularized during the Victorian era. So the Victorian era, as I was saying, saw science and technology rise to heights that the previous generations or the previous eras could not even imagine. And so Robert Louis Stevenson's world, the world in which he was living, was being influenced by new and unknown ideas. And some of this certainly and definitely comes across in Dr. Jekyll's experimentation with nature, or more specifically with the nature of man, and another character, Lannion's distrust of his unscientific ideas. So what I'm to break this down even further for you, what I'm trying to say is science and technology became more prominent than ever before, right? Today technology is in our fingertips, right? At our fingertips, we use mobile phones, computers, tablets, wearable gadgets, all of that stuff. In the Victorian era, these things were not present, but the inventions, the technologies that were invented during the Victorian era eventually led to the creation of all the technology that we use today. For example, think of the telephone, right? We use mobile phones today. Even 15-20 years ago, people didn't have mobile phones, right? We used to use landline phones, and this landline phone technology was invented during the Victorian era, and that is also when it eventually started being popularized. So similarly, telegram, right? So people, or telegraph, right? So all of these things, sending messages to faraway people, right? Radio technologies, all of these major inventions were done around that time. Also, you have to remember, in medical science, major inventions and discoveries were made during the Victorian era. And why am I talking about science and technology so much? Because these inventions are the foundation of the text you are going to study, that is the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So as we move further into the text, which will be in the subsequent lectures, you'll realize the role of science and technology in formation of a plot so interesting as the novel you're going to read. So I'll not talk about that today further, but as I said, in the subsequent lectures we're going to talk a great deal about science and technology and the experimentations that take place in this novel. So let's now talk about some related literary works. Now, many writers have been influenced by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, leading to a kind of legacy of psychological dramas and split personality characters in literature. So today you will find a great number of films and literature and comic books, about psychological conditions and psychological thrillers and dramas and split personality movies where one person has many people residing in him, right? There are extremely popular movies where people have split personality. So psychological dramas and all of that stuff, the root of this kind of films, the root of these kinds of literature is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? So I'll give you some popular examples. The popular example would be within literature. I'm giving you some popular examples. One is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, whose protagonist is very similar to Dr. Jekyll, haunted by a rival self, an image of youth and beauty, and the monstrosity that can be caused by scientific experimentation also recalls the similarly gothic world of Frankenstein. I think you have heard of Frankenstein. So in Frankenstein, a man named Frankenstein, he goes and does an experiment, and through his experiment he creates another human being, right? But his experiment is not entirely successful. The creature he has created is not very much in line with his expectations. It's very different, and it turns out to be disastrous. Similarly, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you have scientific experimentation as a core theme, and the psychological drama or the split personality issue that arises out of scientific experimentation becomes an important theme here. Okay, now to end this introductory lecture, I'm going to at last talk about some key facts. These facts have to do with when the book was written, what is its genre, all of that. So first, what is the full title of the text? Now, popularly, when people talk about this book, they usually say Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But the full title of the text is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This may be an important short question answer. But also remember that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is not the full title. It's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So next, when was it written? This book was written sometime in 1885, and it was published the next year in 1886. And as I already mentioned, the literary period is Victorian. And for those of you who do not know Victorian is, I will once again repeat that Victorian refers to the life and era of Queen Victoria. So the entire duration of Queen Victoria's life, sometime, like I said, beginning in the mid 1830s to 1901. So nearly 65 or more than 65 years Queen Victoria was alive, and her lifetime or her reign as queen, her duration as Queen of Britain is called Victorian. Okay, Victorian period or Victorian era. And so this text is also written at that time, and action is also set during the Victorian era. And so what is the genre of this novel? So it is definitely a horror story. There is a great deal of drama. It is also Victorian Gothic, and you may also call it a psychological drama. Okay, so these are some genres within which you can categorize this text. And what is the setting of this text? In other words, where do the events of this book take place? It's mostly in London, and a lot of the action is in the streets of London, right? But generally speaking, it is in London. So now, is there a protagonist? Is there an antagonist? About those I'm not going to talk in today's class, and I'm hoping you will all start reading the text soon. But I will leave you with one last bit of information about the text as an introductory bit, that is the point of view. So the point of view in this novel is a third person narrator. Okay, so what do I mean by point of view? You will see that some stories are told from the I point of view, that I am so and so, I witnessed so and so, right? The story or the novel or the film is being told or narrated from the I, from the perspective of the narrator. But in this novel it's not like that, it is a third person narrator, right? So Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, they are not the narrator. The novel does not go like I am Dr. Jekyll or I am Mr. Hyde and today I did this experiment. No, the novel is more like in London there was a person called Dr. Jekyll and he did an experiment. I hope you are able to see the difference between first person and third person narrator. So in the first person narrator, the narrator speaks of himself in the using the word I, and in the third person narrator, the narrator may or may not be part of the narrative. Okay, he may be someone who knows what the story is but may not be a part of the events of the story. So a third person narrator tells the story in this novel, and the third person narrator has knowledge of everything, right? Who is thinking what he feels or what she feels, where he or she is going. Third person narrator has all that information. And so that's mostly it for the introductory lecture. I'm going to end this lecture here today, and from the next lecture we are going to talk about the plot summary, and eventually we are going to talk about the themes in this text. But I'm hoping you will all start reading the text.